And this particular instance, it was a real abuse of trust, and someone who was supposed to be performing good work on behalf of domestic violence victims, who in fact was enriching herself. And so what we discovered is when it came to our attention this year, it came to our attention through the HHS Inspector General had been trying to get information from the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence and how they were spending money from the state. And the state gives them tens of millions of dollars each year. They, while promising to give the information just for over 2 years, never gave the information that was being requested. So the House of Representatives, the investigation was handed to me to take over as the chairman of the Public Integrity and Ethics, and the House of Representatives took the extraordinary step of issuing subpoenas off the House floor to Tiffany Carr and the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Now, just real briefly to tell you the scope of the problem that we ended up discovering is in the past 3 years, Ms. Carr, who was its executive director, had taken over $7.5 million in personal compensation out of the coalition. That's money that should have and could have been going to domestic violence shelters around the state, but was not. She did it in extraordinary ways. I mean, she received a hefty salary. Her salary grew from $75,000 to about $760,000 by the time we got there. But there was also, it appears that the board was working with her to do these types of things. But it was also extraordinary how she was hiding the amount of compensation, true compensation she was getting. I remember in one instance, she had over 400 days of PTO that renewed annually and were payable annually that she was taking the payment for. And so in a 3-year span, it ended up being about $7.5 million. We conducted that investigation. There's still some more of that investigation to conduct when we can get back together in conjunction with the governor's office. And now the U.S. Attorney's Office is looking into it as well. And I expect we will see some resolution to her particular issue. So I mention that because it was both extraordinary that the House took the extraordinary measure to issue subpoenas, and because I think it is one of those instances where an individual is able to abuse the trust of the public, and I want you to know that we look out for those types of things. I think I'll just go straight into COVID by the numbers now and start talking to it. And just so you guys know how I formulate my opinions is I don't concentrate too much on what any particular news outlet is saying. I don't concentrate too much on what any particular individual is saying. I like to look at the numbers. My favorite news channels are actually the business channels. And I like to see where business people are, putting their money down, right? What's happening? I think business in large part has the best research and development. I think following where those who have skin in the game are placing their bets is very useful in figuring out where we need to go. So I like to look at the numbers here. And in Florida, these numbers here's another thing I've learned. If your information is an hour old, it's an hour too old. I'm going to tell you this information is too old because it's from yesterday. But here's the information that we have. In Florida, there's a total number of cases of 33,193. Out of those, 5,419 of the positive cases required hospitalization. That's about 16%. The number of deaths from those 33,193 were 1,218 as of yesterday, or about 0.03%. And so you can start to get a better picture of what the disease looks like, or what the virus looks like, and how it's impacting people's health. I want to step back for a second and talk about the task force. And I was fortunate to be asked onto the governor's task force. And that task force looked solely at the economic impact. The governor has a Department of Health. He has relationships with a number of prominent physicians, all of whom he gets his medical advice from. We were focused exclusively on the economic side of it. And it was the governor's responsibility to layer on top of that the medical side of it. So I'm going to talk about the economic side of it today. Please understand, I'm not being dismissive of the healthcare and medical side of it. This is the part that you've asked me to talk about. One of the things I heard one of the doctors on TV say that I really resonated with me is this. She said it's really a virus, two different viruses based on your age category, and that's true. If you are over the age of 65 or you have an underlying condition, how the virus impacts you is markedly different than if you are under the age of 65. And in fact, these numbers, when you remove those who are over the age of 65, these numbers where I'm talking about, even the 0.03% lethality rate drops to something minuscule if you remove people over the age of 65. So I kind of look at it, and I also thought, that's also true geographically. So if you look at the country, to this day, I think the number today is New York and the tri-state area has 49.5% of all the deaths in the United States. Right? Think about that. So they're concentrated in a small 5-borough area. But it's also true of the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, you have a concentration of cases in the Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. And then the rest of the state is a lot different. And so I thought I'd give you a little snapshot into what the rest of it looks like. We still have 16 cases, or 16 counties as of yesterday, with fewer than 15 total cases from the inception of the pandemic. Fewer than 50. We still have some with 1 case. We have 1 county with over 10,000 cases. And these are all inclusive of the last. We have 2 counties with over 4,000 cases. And if you cut that in half, we only have 3 counties with over 2,000 cases. Now those counties with the over 10, the 4,000, and the 2,000, those are your Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. We have 7 counties with over 1,000 cases. We have 58 counties with less than 500 cases from the inception of the pandemic to now. So you can see that if you've got a county with less than 15 cases, or a county even with less than 500, it's a vastly different place to be than if you're in a county with 10,000 or 2,000 or 4,000. It's just kind of the tale of 2 cities and a different virus depending on where you are geographically and what your age is. Now, Volusia County. Volusia County, as of yesterday, had 448 cases. We had 81 hospitalizations. That's about 18% of those who get hospitalized. And we had 20 deaths, or about 0.04% of the people who catch the disease or the virus in Volusia County. It is fatal for them. So you can see in Volusia County, we are one of those counties where the virus has not had the most significant impact. The economic impact, however, we're going to feel just the same as everyone else. The great thing about how Florida has handled this and where we are today is we've taken the steps necessary to flatten the curve. And for us in Florida, and particularly in Volusia, that curve is in decline. You may see some days that have spikes of the number of positive cases. The number of positive cases is really not a great measure of what's happening, because we are also vastly increasing the number of tests that we give each day. And with increased testing, you will see more positive cases. But that percentage of positive case is what's really important. And so in Florida, as of today, we have tested about 375,000 residents. Yesterday, that positive testing ratio was about 9%, with a negative 91%. That number is actually dropping, and it has bounced around a little bit. That number today is less. If you look at the testing trends, the positive numbers are at about 4 to 6% positive cases. So we're on the backside of the case. The curve has declined for us, and we're very fortunate for that to have happened. I find these statistics useful. In Florida, if you take a sampling of 100,000 citizens, in Florida we've had 150 of every 100,000 citizens test positive. Well, in the country, that number is 308. So you can see we're less than half of how the rest of the country is doing if you look at it as a whole. In Florida, our lethality rate or fatal rate is about 5.07 of every 100,000 people. The disease or the virus is fatal. That's about 17 compared to about 17.4 out of every 100,000 if you look at the national numbers. Now, in Volusia County, our numbers are even better than the state as an average. In Volusia County, about 86 of every 100,000 people tested are positive. And only about 3.64 of every 100,000 is the virus fatal. So what you see developing is that the case is concentrated. The viruses are concentrated in a small geographic area. the virus and the lethality is concentrated into a small window of age ranges, 65 and up. Mostly also have had, if it's a fatality, mostly they've also had underlying conditions. And so it's just, it's just a different virus depending on who you are and where you are. Now, one of the things I want people to understand out there is that, the predictions were pretty fatalistic when they first came out, and even the modified predictions were pretty fatalistic. But what you need to know is that no one in Florida has ever been denied a hospital bed, right? No one. No one has ever been denied a ventilator. No one has ever been denied treatment across the entire state, regardless of where you are. If you had it, then you went for medical treatment, you were given it. Currently, our testing exceeds demand. I was interested to read an article yesterday about how that's true nationwide, that we have this testing capacity, but we're not matching up the demand to get to that capacity to both test and process through laboratories. And when you read the article, it was more of a logistics problem than a capacity problem. I can tell you in the state of Florida, even in South Florida, where this was hit the hardest, they have the capacity to test at 750 per day at each site, right? In South Florida, you may have a day where somebody showed up and there were more than 750 people showed up, and so they couldn't get tested that day. But what you saw immediately and what we've seen across the state is the second day, that number was about 600 people showed up to get tested. So there was excess capacity. Then that number fell to 5, and then it's balanced out somewhere between 400 and 500. So there is the capacity out there. It's about getting that test to the people who need that test. One of the things I love, and one of the things that the Florida House of Representatives has concentrated on over the last 2 years was, broadening the scope of medical practice to people who can perform these things that are necessary while still protecting them. So one of the things the governor did that I loved is he said, there's no reason your pharmacist can't administer this test. And that's true. Well, if you broaden the distribution network of testing, you can vastly increase the number of people who are getting tested. So we are doing that. I think we're taking the right steps to do that. And I think we're going in the right direction. I want to talk to you a little bit about hospital beds. Typically a hospital has about 12% of its beds unused prior to COVID. About 12%. So they're through elective surgeries and the emergencies and other things that come up, they typically still only have about 12% of their beds unused. As of yesterday, we had hospitals had 39% of their beds unused in the state of Florida. And if you go down and focus just on the Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach, and even throw in Orlando in there, in those areas, they have about 40% of their beds unused. Okay, so there's capacity out there. Same is true for ICU beds. So I think that we look pretty good as a state as far as how we've weathered this virus. I think the governor's plan to reopen. Hey, he did exactly what he said he was going to do. I mean, I was involved in all of these discussions and watched all of the press conferences and things. He did what he said he was going to do. He said he was going to take a measured approach to reopening the state. It wasn't going to be the same across the state. He may treat the 3 counties in Southeast Florida differently. He did. We're at phase 1 right now, and he laid out what phase 1 was. And, it's going to start to bring us back to some degree of normalcy. I think we're going to have social distancing. I think we're going to have remote working. I mean, for those of you who are thinking about your business, I think remote working is here to stay. And one of the things this did is prove to us, and I know, in my company, Foundation Risk Partners, we're about 90% of our employees are remote working, and our productivity is still up. So I think we've proven to ourselves, and business has proven to itself that, yeah, remote working does work. We can survive that way. I think that's here to stay. I think social distancing to some extent is here to stay. And I don't want to conflate shelter at home and social distancing, because they're not the same. But the hand washing, why aren't you doing that from the beginning, by the way? The hand washing, the hand sanitization, which I'm a huge fan of, always have been. I think part of that is here to stay, right? And I think the 6 feet distance, we may see people get more comfortable over time and get a little bit closer, but I think for the immediate future, it's here to stay. a couple things that I just think are very encouraging. When I told you earlier that I like to follow what the business trends are, because that tells me what degree of confidence that we have in certain things. I've been following what the pharmaceutical companies and what the manufacturers have been doing for pharmaceuticals. You know, you read 2 weeks ago that some of the pharmaceutical companies were ramping up production of certain therapeutics, even though those therapeutics had not received even initial FDA approval. It's because what they knew in their business and where they were betting their money was that they were on to something. And that's still the case. And so now you probably read the stories about, I can't say it well, remdesivir, I think it is, and how Gilead has ramped up production of that before it's received approvals. And now we know as of yesterday that that drug has had such promising impact on the virus that they've already moved into human testing. They're ramping up phase 2 and phase 3 of that drug to get ready to release it, because they think they are going to get that approval and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is there. I'm also very encouraged by what we're hearing out of Oxford University and the National Institute of Health about a potential vaccine. And their testing, early testing, has gone so well and was able to be replicated in Colorado, the National Institute of Health, that they are moving immediately into human testing in May here. And they expect that they will have a vaccine by September. Now, what will happen along the way here is the closer they get to that, they'll start to ramp up production so they can immediately turn out that vaccine and start distributing it to healthcare providers so that people can have a vaccine. I think with a vaccine and a therapeutic, you know, how we talk about COVID-19 is vastly different than without it. I'm really interested to look back a year from now and see how the story is written on COVID-19, you know, what we did that worked, what we did that didn't work, what we may do differently in the next pandemic. I think that in a year from now, that perspective is going to be vastly different than perhaps, you know, the day-to-day, the hour-to-hour stuff that we've lived. So I'm optimistic about the medical side of it. I love to hear that we're close to a vaccine. I love to hear that we've got a therapeutic on the way. And I think with the medical side, once people have that, you know, that consumer confidence again, the economic side of it will come into play. The governor said last night that he didn't think this was a matter of months to move into phase 2, that he thought it was a matter of weeks. I think, and what I'm going to advocate for is that, you know, we should take a very targeted approach here. You know, if you're in a county with very limited virus exposure, and like I said, we got, 16 counties with less than 15 cases. You know, maybe they can move a little more expeditiously to phase 2 and reopening their economy. So I'm going to advocate that to the governor and the governor's office and hope that we see that. You know, right now I woke up today thinking, man, I need a haircut. And 2, I'd really like to just go out to dinner. You know, please let me go sit down at a restaurant and have somebody serve me a nice steak and then take it all away where I don't have to clean it up. So I'm encouraged. I'm ready to move on to the next phase. You know, Michelle and I are ready to be released back into the wild, but we're ready to go, and I'm encouraged of where we're headed. And with that, I'll close and open it up to anything you may have for me.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate it. I do think it's really important for all of us to understand the facts and the health statistics, because that does matter. I mean, we have to do this right as we reopen the economy. And I know that I was also pleased to hear the governor say there's really no timeline, and he's going to look at things very strategically to allow us to move forward with what's best for our community. There were a couple of questions that came in, and I see a few more that are coming in through the chat room, but I did want to talk about the issue with the unemployment. Do you have any insight as to if we're going to see some resolve in getting that straightened out sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I wish I had more insight into that, and I've looked at it, and quite frankly, we've dedicated our folks here to trying to help folks. Our resources are necessarily limited, but the short of it is this: and if you look at it and the surge of cases that came in, and I forget the exact statistic, but I think the number of cases that came in 1 week was about 4 times what the state has typically received in a year, right? So it was If you look, pre-surge of those cases, you had a design flaw that was masked by low volume. So they were able to get away with it. And I can tell you pre this, I haven't had anyone claim or excuse me, complain to me about the unemployment system, right? So at that lower capacity, it seemed to work. There was never going to be a system that was designed to handle that flood of cases in a week and 2 weeks. Nonetheless, we have to get help to people. And so if you look at post-surge, I think the problems have been an unmitigated disaster with that Connect system. But I think what the governor has done to address it was the right thing to do, and really about the only thing you could do, right? He added new systems so you could get around Connect and you could file a claim, and I think it's PEGA, and then added paper claims. Now I'll tell you, one of the downsides of that is people are filing everywhere they can, and so now it takes more time to verify a single claim because you're only allowed to have one claim number. But they have to go through and they have to weed out the multiple claims that are going through. I think what the governor did in reassigning 2,200 workers in the state to help DEO process those claims, absolutely the right thing to do. Nonetheless, we've got people who are suffering and they're not getting their money. I've got, let me see here, I've got some statistics on it, and it's not that everyone is not getting their money, it is just that not everyone has gotten their money. So if you look at it, we've had over 2 million claims submitted, processed 675,000 claims, paid roughly 400,000 claims, and we've already paid out, $553 million in claims, unemployment claims. So it's not that the state is doing nothing; it's just they can't keep up with the demand that's coming in, and no one's ever seen anything like this before. So it's hard to prepare for something that no one ever contemplated. Nonetheless, we're doing the best that we can to process those claims and make sure that people get the assistance that they need.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Tom. None of us could have predicted that we would be needing a system that could be that robust. And that's not something specific to Florida. That's all across the nation. So, we just hope that we'll keep that up front and continue to look at how we make sure that we get the dollars into the hands of the people that are desperately in need of that. And just as a side, there is the new, I believe it's pandemic unemployment insurance. Those guidelines are up on our website in the COVID Center, so you can go there. And I know our Career Source is doing a fabulous job of trying to help people through this. So there are resources out there, and we're here to help you link up with those as necessary. Let's go through some of the chat room as well. First of all, Angie Pye, who runs our Beacon Center, wanted to say thank you for your involvement in investigating the domestic abuse situation. Angie and her team does a fabulous job locally, so she does appreciate that, and that's your big kudo. You don't have to respond to it, but I did want to go and make that public for everybody to hear in regards to that. There are a lot of questions coming in about the reopening. So, we've gone through phase one. We understand what that means for a select group of businesses. That's restaurants. We understand that, 25% capacity along with outdoor seating. We understand that elective surgery is now open and encouraged. Now, I assume, or can you answer the question, that it also reflects dentist appointments, doctor appointments? Were they phased into phase one at this point?
They were, and that's expressly put into the executive order. But yes, dentists, I think pediatrician, there are a number of them put in there. Yes, right. So they're open.
They're open. Okay. So, a lot of people are anxious to get to their hairdressers, get back to the gym, do all of those things. Do you, in some of your discussions on the task force, do you think that that's part of the next phase that you'll see coming forward for some of those businesses that, could provide some of the protection if they were given some direction and allowance to do that and make that decision for their particular business?
I do see it. It's not here yet. Let me just as an aside tell you that one of my favorite quips about this entire thing happening was about 30 days ago when it started. One of my wife's friends said, "We are 30 days away from knowing what everyone's true hair color is," which I found to be hilarious because she's right? People can't get in there and get done what they need to get done. You know, if you noticed yesterday, what the governor was very specific in doing is outlining phase one. But what he didn't tell you was what phase two is. And that's intentional, because I think what we are able to do and how broad phase two is for reopening is largely dependent upon how we weather phase one. So if we weather phase one, we haven't seen a spike in cases. We haven't seen the positivity rate start to climb any more than it used to. Then I think that gives us confidence that we can do more in opening up in phase two. And the governor has been very deliberate about this. And in my one-on-one conversations with him and our task force conversations, yeah, he has maintained from the beginning he's going to look at the data. And I'll tell you that this is a governor who will sit in his office. I just talked to one of the staff members. He flew back from Orlando from our press conference, sat down with all of the task force recommendations, including public comments, sat in his office for the next 10 hours and read them and processed them. He is very much a research and data guy. So I think how the community reacts to phase one is going to largely determine what we can do in phase two. But he didn't say these are the things we're going to do in phase two. And you'll see that on the federal guidelines, they kind of do. I know Governor DeSantis thinks, well, if things look good, we could probably do more than that. But if they don't look good, we may have to do less than that. So a lot of it's going to be how we weather phase one.
Yeah, that's actually part of my feedback at the end of this, but it's a great segue into talking about our responsibility as business owners, as business leaders, as employees and employers to make sure that we do follow the guidelines that have been set forth, because they can be pulled back. They can be restricted even more. So we do have a responsibility to do it right from the beginning. So how should businesses that are not specifically mentioned in the order handle reopening? If they've established their protocols to protect their employees, but going by CDC recommendations, and they allow people and their employees to come back to the office to work?
Well, the way to look at this is you have to start with the original executive order and what were declared essential activities and services at that time. So that's your base. If you were permitted to go back to work back then, you are permitted to do that today. Now, the new executive order adds things and activities and businesses that are allowed to go back to work with social distancing. So if you were permitted to do it originally in the executive order and you are now permitted to do it in the second executive order, you can go back and you put in your protocols, start business again. If you are not, then you are not one of the permitted businesses to go back to work.
Right, and I know that executive order is available and online for anybody to read in detail so that they can dive into that a little bit. We've shared it through our social media and certainly can bring that link back up again. I see Joyce Shanahan has provided that. Thank you, Joyce, appreciate it. I want to do one more thing before we move on to some of the financial things, but there is concern from the business community about litigation. As we get back into this. And I know this is something you're very passionate about. How do we protect businesses if they start to reopen for business and they're trying to follow all the proper, they are following all the proper protocols? What's a protection to them?
Well, right now there's not much, right? So it would go through the normal court system, the normal court process. And I mentioned this in the task force meeting, but I think it is a sad day when you can see our frontline medical workers starting to get sued because of decisions they made during a pandemic. And if you think about that, what we've asked folks to do is we've pushed decisions that would normally be made by a doctor down from a doctor or be made over the course of days. Now it has to be made in 5 minutes. And so we've had to make some decisions like that. And to give you an example, elective surgery means it can be scheduled, right? It's not like cosmetic surgery necessarily. It's just something that can be scheduled. Well, we necessarily, as a medical community, had to tell patients, your surgery, because it is elective, cannot take place, right? We think that you can wait. And we've made that kind of qualitative decision that whatever your underlying condition is, we think that the procedure that you need can wait until the end of this. Well, with that comes exposure, right? And with that, now you've got a frontline worker making this decision who 6 months from now, when this is all over, can be sued because of the decision they made during a pandemic. I think that's a problem. I don't have an immediate solution for that. I have, I believe in sensible tort reform. I'm not trying to kill all the lawyers, but I think there are some abuses of the system out there, and I push it forward. But I tell you, it's tough. It's tough. If you read any of the Florida Chamber stuff this year, some of the articles, the trial bar, the plaintiffs' lawyers are very, very powerful, and the only way to get around that is to elect people to your legislature who agree with you on tort reform.
Thank you. And one of the questions, and this has been something we've dealt with almost daily here, is the difficulty in accessing funding at the federal level. I know you're a state representative, but I think it's important to realize there are several groups of people that have been kind of left out to do this on their own. That could be independent contractors, real estate sales, chambers of commerce.
Yeah.
We have no access to funding, but it's our job to be there for our businesses. So do you see any financial relief in any form coming from the state, or do you have any insight as to what's going to be coming down from the federal and maybe the next phase? I guess it would be 4. I think the last one was 3.5.
Yeah, I know they've talked about that at the federal level. I don't have any insight beyond what I'm seeing on the news. I don't know that anything's coming from the state. We don't. That would have to be an emergency order. Money coming through an emergency order. We don't have that. Only the legislature can appropriate money. Right now we're not scheduled to go back up. We may be back up in May or June to distribute the federal money that's coming into the state, but it's just too soon to know how that's going to play out. I think that relief primarily is going to come from the federal government, and I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but the truth of the matter is the federal government just print money whenever they want, right? And they seem to be willing to do that. In the state of Florida, we have a constitutional requirement that we can't spend more than we take in. And so even when we pass a $94 billion budget, we're actually telling you these are the revenues we expect to get in. We're not telling you we've got the money, but these are the revenues we expect to get in. If those revenues don't materialize, then that budget gets adjusted. And so where it may have started at 94 billion, it may end up at 89 billion because we didn't get the revenues in that we thought we would get in. And so the state doesn't have that kind of leeway to just decide we're going to go and give, $2.2 trillion to this. So I don't think you'll see it from the state. The federal government has that kind of leeway.
Thank you. Question is, will there be any local offices opening where somebody can set an appointment or socially distance properly to talk about their claim with a person? One of the difficulties, as you know, is even getting through to have a conversation with somebody. Are you aware that any are going to open? And if you're not, if there's people online, because we've got a great diverse group on this line listening to the conversation. If you know of information, please feel free to add that to the chat room as well. But Tom, are you aware of anything?
No, I'm not aware of any additional offices being opened. Right now they're still trying to deal with the capacity of coming through, and even with the extra employees, they've got shifts working around the clock, right? Even with the excess employees that we've added to it, they're still trying to get caught up from the demand that was created initially. So I don't know. We have trouble too. When we call and try to help a constituent out with a claim, we call and we get put in a queue just like everyone else. And sometimes you get a call back right away. Sometimes you don't get a call back.
Thank you. We're a special events town. We're a hospitality town. You know the demographics as well as anybody as a lifetime resident here or a longtime resident here. As you look into the next phase, how do you see that? I mean, the social distancing, we obviously understand. Has there been any conversation about when the numbers start to change as far as number of people in a room or an outdoor activity? Have you had conversations regarding that? Yeah,
we did. And the governor's order addresses part of that in phase 1. And this is me parsing words and kind of doing my hyper-anal lawyer thing here, but when I read the 10-person rule, it says limit to 10 persons where you are I think it says where you are unable to socially distance, right? So that leaves open the idea that you could have a larger gathering as long as you can social distance. And I had a really informative conversation with Tim Curtis at at Hooligans, and we were talking about it. And as I was doing my homework, we were talking about, well, how do you get people back into the restaurants? And he rightly pointed out, you can't just say 50% capacity, right? Because the issue is really one of social distancing, the 6-foot separation and square footage. And that may be less than 50% capacity, maybe more like 25. And I think that's how the governor got to where he is. But I think the key is, can you put people in a place where they can be socially distant from each other? You know, my wife and I call them germ pods, right? So we've got our germ pod with our, with my brother and a couple of family members, and that's our germ pod, and we have not gone out. So it's okay if we're together within 6 feet. But if we go to dinner, our germ pod needs to be able to be 6 feet away from somebody else's germ pod. And so I think it's going to be more of a square footage thing than a percentage of capacity. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be an arbitrary cap at 10. I think it's what can you do safely.
Well, we all know the governor is doing this very strategically, keeping in mind that, safety is first and foremost. And as a Chamber of Commerce, we do want business to get back with the understanding that we all are going to have to make some pretty major sacrifices in order to have this happen right. Another question that has come in is in regards to state parks. So golf courses are allowed to be open. Do you foresee in the very near future the opportunity to reopen the state parks for recreation?
Yes. In fact, I can't remember whether I saw that in this order or not, but I can tell you in my conversations with the governor, he is very big on getting people outside and exercising and in the sunlight. And, there's probably no better place that you can be socially distant from other folks than in a state park. So yes, I do see that coming very quickly.
Great. So prior to the pandemic, the state budget was presented to the governor. And what do you see as the major changes or impacts to the state budget as we're moving forward and beyond the pandemic and everything that's happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's going to be rough. And for just for clarity's sake, the budget has not been presented to the governor yet. He asked us to hold off on it while he dealt with this pandemic issue. And then once it goes to him, then he has, I forget the number of days, but it's only so many days, a window within which to either sign it, veto and sign it. I think Stephanie's yelling at me, it's 15 days. So, it hasn't gone to him yet, but let me kind of, explain the problem from the economic side of it that we've got. I think the number is $2.7 billion per month the state would typically take in from sales tax revenue, right? So that's a huge number. That's a huge number. Well, let's say that because of the mitigation measures and it wasn't entirely a shutdown order that you had essential services. Let's say that problem is only $1 billion a month, and let's say that inclusive of the 2 months we had and kind of the tail that continues, it's a 6-month problem. Well, you got a $6 billion problem, all right? The state, which is still the #1 state in the country for fiscal soundness, has a $4 billion reserve. All right, so you got a $6 billion hole and a $4 billion reserve. Let's assume, for the sake of this argument, that we wanted to take all $4 billion and apply it to this one budget year. Right, so now we only have a $2 billion hole. Everybody says, well, cut the pork. Pork, you mean projects, and those projects for me are typically, septic to sewer and road projects. So let's say you want to cut out all of the projects. That's about $100 million. Right, so now you've got a $1.9 billion hole. Well, let's say you want to cut out university construction projects. You want to delay those a year. It's about $100 million in any given year. I got a $1.8 billion hole. Well, and I'm not suggesting we do this. Everybody relax. But let's say we sweat the Sadowski fund and took all of that money. That's $300 million. So we're still at a $1.5 billion hole. I think the impact is going to be significant. I think the not accounting for the federal money right now. I think that the governor is going to have some tough choices. You won't hear me talk very much about the projects that we got funded. There are a number of them because I'm not convinced they're going to be there at the end of the day. How do you make up for the impact that we still don't know the bounds of it yet? Right? We don't know how devastating the economic harm is at this point. It's still developing. So how do you do that? And I don't know. what typically happens is we issue a budget based on budget revenues, and then there are mechanisms. If that money doesn't come in, it adjusts, and it keeps adjusting. And so, folks who thought they were getting X amount may get less because the revenues weren't there. Constitutionally, we're not allowed to spend money we don't have.
Will you go back to a special session, do you believe, at sometime in the near future to address that so that there can be some knowledge or certainty of what's going to be available to people that we're expecting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we may have to go back necessarily to appropriate the federal money that's coming in. So I think that's the legislature's job. They have to do that. Even if we went back in, let's say, June and revamped the entire budget, remember, we're just forecasting budget revenues. So that degree of certainty is just, it's never there, even in a normal year. Now, because we've had such amazing growth for so long, you could always count on those revenues being there. But whether we can have them going forward or not is we're not going to have that certainty this year.
Yeah, so another question came in, and it's an important question. Housing and affordable housing will be even more needed. You think about the mental services, all of those things. The hope is that those needed and necessary things will be kept, or at least rise to the top. And I'm sure your comment on the Sadowski Fund, while it was meant in jest, and you did say you weren't suggesting that, that probably hit home for a few people. As you know, we've said that we just need the money to stay there for what it's intended for, which is affordable housing.
Yeah, and that's fair. But I think I think everything is on the table right now. And what you've got to remember about Florida's budget is, I think it's 48% of our budget is committed to Medicaid already. So there's not a lot of room in there. You can't really cut out of Medicaid. I forget how much of it is already committed recurring wise for education, how much of it is already committed to the Department of Corrections, how much is already committed to projects underway for Department of Transportation. But by the time you look at it, the vast majority of the money that the state allocates every year is recurring. So it is money that we can't necessarily touch. Right, so that leaves only those things that are not recurring that you can go in and adjust, and that unfortunately shrinks the field of things that you can look at. I don't have a good look right now into what that's going to be.
So, Representative, first of all, thank you for your always honest and frank conversation. It really is very refreshing to all of us. Those last few questions were pretty sobering questions. So before we let you go, I want you to end this conversation on a real positive note, and maybe share with the attendees here, how as being a resident here, we're a resilient community. I'm going to let you close on a really positive note before I close out the program.
Well, one of the things that's happened by, I'm typically on the road and traveling, and now I'm home. I'm pretty sure Michelle's trying to kill me over the last couple of days, but I'm home for a while. And it's allowed me to do things I don't typically get to do. Michelle and I, we use our waterways a lot, and you get out and you get to see where you get to live again, and you start to appreciate it. You start to see that it's an amazingly beautiful place that we live, whether it's parks, the ocean, the river. It just allows you with this extra time to appreciate your surroundings. And I think those types of checks, right? Those type of things where you just kind of check in on yourself are healthy. And if there's anything that tells me that we are going to be okay and the state of Florida is going to be okay, is when I sit out at night. I get to have dinner at home now. It's interesting. I sit out at night and I look at the sunset. And some of you follow me on Facebook. I like to post them because it's just remarkable, and the place that we live is remarkable. That gives me hope that we're going to be okay.
Well, we appreciate that. Chamber of Commerce always likes to end things on a positive note, and we do appreciate your leadership. As I said, you've been incredibly accessible to all of us, and we know that the road ahead is going to be tough and tough decisions, but we're here as a resource, and wish you the best of luck as you move forward and make some very tough decisions on behalf of the community and the state as a whole. I promised the representative I would get him out into another call. He is going back to back to back as usual. and working hard on our behalf. So in closing, I want to thank everybody for participating today. A special thank you to our sponsor, FPL, Florida Power and Light, great community partners. If you're not aware of what they're doing in discounting bills for residents, it's an incredible community effort. We really appreciate that. Continue to visit the Chamber's COVID page. We upload and change documents out by the hour. We're trying to really keep you up to date on what's available. Representative Leek's office has provided us with some additional information, and we'll make that available to you as well. As you leave and start to go into this slow reopening, remember your responsibility to follow the guidelines. Our governor is really trying to do this in the right way so that we don't end up having to pull back and restrict even further. So go out there, do the business as safely as you can, and remember, we're all in this together, and we're going to get through it. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.
Thank you, guys.